Buenos días de nuevo. Es un placer tomar de nuevo la palabra ante ustedes para esta primera sesión del segundo Congreso de la Asociación Española de Derecho de la Energía. Esta sesión está dedicada a una conferencia que va a impartir la profesora Leigh Hancher, a quien tendré el honor de presentar en unos minutos. Pero antes voy a dedicar unos breves minutos para hacer una semblanza biográfica del profesor doctor Gaspar Ariño Ortíz en 1936-2023. Gaspar Ariño era presidente de honor de la Asociación Española de Derecho de la Energía y nació un 6 de enero en 1936 en Valencia, España, y murió el 5 de enero de este año, es decir, un día antes de cumplir 86 años. El problema de hablar de alguien que ha fallecido es que quien tiene que hacer la semblanza se apropia de la biografía de Gaspar Ariño y no hace falta decir que su figura es tan grande, tan polifacética, tan variada, tan intensa, que es imposible de llenar y mucho menos por mí. De modo que voy a limitarme a señalar algunos pocos aspectos de esa vida tan intensa, prolífica y polifacética. Gaspar Ariño, que nació en Valencia, estudió bachillerato en el Colegio San José de los Jesuitas de Valencia y en esa universidad llevó a cabo sus estudios de licenciatura entre 1953 y 1958. Siempre que visitaba Valencia le gustaba pasear por las calles de la antigua Universidad Literaria de Valencia y pararse ante la estatua de Luis Vives. Esta es una de las características de la vida de Gaspar. Su humanismo, su interés por el humanismo en general, no solo por el derecho, como excelso jurista que era, sino también por ciencias ligadas al derecho, a las ciencias sociales. De hecho, su despacho estuvo siempre presidido por un cuadro de Tomás Moro, que eran, como saben, bien amigos de Luis Vives y ambos bien amigos de Erasmo de Rotterdam, que constituyeron ese triángulo de humanistas del siglo XVI. El cuadro que tenía a sus espaldas en su despacho era uno que él había encargado y que es una mezcla del retrato que hay en el Museo del Prado de Tomás Moro, de Rubens, y otro que hay en la Free Collection de Nueva York, de Hans Holbein el Joven, y encargó a un pintor que le hiciera un retrato de Tomás Moro, simbiosis de ambos retratos. Tomás Moro era para Gaspar una persona que había defendido la conciencia individual frente al poder. Y esto es algo que caracterizaba su posición ideológica en el mundo, la defensa de la libertad personal frente al poder. Era un liberal, como algo a lo que luego me referiré. Sin duda que de entre todas las facetas del profesor Ariño, la que más destaca es su condición de universitario, profesor e investigador. Él decía, poco antes de morir, que si quería que se le recordara por algo era por haber sido un profesor de la universidad. Tras terminar la licenciatura en Valencia, se trasladó a Madrid para hacer el doctorado y empezó a asistir al curso de doctorado de don Joaquín Garrigues en Derecho Mercantil. Pero tuvo que trasladarse a Zaragoza, creo que por el servicio militar, y allí, en un curso de doctorado al que asistió de Aurelio Guaita Martorell, administrativista, decidió dedicar su vida al derecho administrativo. De regreso a Madrid, elaboró la tesis doctoral bajo la dirección de José Luis Villar Palasí, uno de los grandes maestros del derecho administrativo español, sobre la teoría del equivalente económico de los contratos administrativos, que publicó en 1968. Esta teoría del equivalente económico de los contratos administrativos es una obra señera en el derecho administrativo español. Y él fue un reputado especialista en contratación pública, que es como en uno de los artículos que tiene la revista de Administración Pública, se titula El misterio del contrato administrativo. Pero él supo ahondar, él supo darnos luz, iluminarnos sobre qué significa eso del contrato administrativo. A su regreso a Madrid, se integró en la Escuela Nacional de Administración Pública, que acababa de ser fundada, y en el Instituto de Estudios Administrativos, y desde ese centro desarrolló una cualificada actividad investigadora que le condujo a escribir y publicar algunos de los libros pilares de nuestro derecho administrativo. Y voy a seleccionar tres. La Administración Institucional, de 1972, que nos mostró a todos el significado que la personalidad jurídica tiene en la organización. La afectación de bienes al servicio público, para ayudarnos a comprender cuál es la finalidad que hay en esa afectación de bienes. Y las tarifas de los servicios públicos, que nos mostró cómo la tarifa de esos servicios públicos había sido descontractualizada a lo largo del siglo XX. Estas son unas someras pinceladas de lo que convirtió, de la biografía, de la parte de la biografía que convirtió a Gaspar Ariño en un significado administrativista, uno de los grandes administrativistas de su generación. Pero como en todas las biografías interesantes, hay un dato disruptivo, algo que rompe esa trayectoria, que la rompe para bien, y es que se marcha a los Estados Unidos, becado por la Fundación Ford, en el año 1975. Cuando los publicistas españoles seguían con la mirada puesta a lo proveniente de Italia, Francia, Alemania, Gaspar Ariño se va a Estados Unidos y en la Brookings Institution de Washington y en otras instituciones estadounidenses como la Rand Corporation de California, 1976-77, descubrió la regulación en el sentido anglo-norteamericano de la palabra. Y a eso se dedicó ininterrumpidamente entre 1975 y 2022. Por ejemplo, cuando se va a Estados Unidos, él ya era un experto en contratación administrativa, pero descubrió que el contrato es también una forma de regular, la regulation by contract. Su estudio en Estados Unidos fue providencial porque coincidió en un momento en que en las escuelas de pensamiento norteamericanas se abandonaba el keynesianismo dominante a favor de un nuevo monetarismo, Milton Friedman, la Escuela de Chicago, y por eso le permitió estar familiarizado con unos conceptos que luego se pusieron de moda en Europa a partir de 1979. A su regreso de Estados Unidos ganó la cátedra de Derecho Administrativo y fue catedrático de Derecho Administrativo primero en la Universidad de La Laguna, en las Islas Canarias, y luego en varias universidades peninsulares. Entre otras, fue catedrático de Derecho Administrativo en la Facultad de Ciencias Empresariales aquí en Barcelona. Además de profesor universitario, fue abogado durante largas décadas. Un despacho que empezó en la calle Santa Engracia de Madrid y que luego se trasladó a la calle Serrano y se especializó en contratación pública, energía, telecomunicaciones, agua, transporte, servicios públicos. Todo esto es lo que mereció que cuando Vicente López Ibor y otros pusimos en marcha la Asociación Española de Derecho Administrativo, Gaspar fuese propuesto como presidente de honor. El profesor Ariño Ortíz era un polemista, estaba muy interesado en la vida pública española, le gustaba polemizar, tenía ideas para trasladarlas y esto es lo que le condujo a la actividad política. Fue diputado por el Partido Popular por Valencia entre 1989 y 1993 y estaba en ese partido en la sección liberal porque fue vicepresidente del Partido Liberal. Esto le condujo a escribir con frecuencia en los periódicos. En Expansión publicaba periódicamente columnas de un gran atractivo periodístico. Y también en los últimos años de su vida escribió varios libros sobre cuestiones muy candentes de la vida política española, como Regenerar el Estado, Reconstruir la democracia, La corona, Reflexiones en voz baja, La independencia de Cataluña, La nueva izquierda, Perfiles identitarios, Populismo y democracia, Democracia e igualdad, entre otros libros. En el primer gobierno del señor Aznar fue miembro del Consejo de Privatizaciones, pero estuvo muy pocos meses porque enseguida fue designado miembro del Consejo de Administración de la entonces Telefónica o Movistar, y eso le condujo a numerosos viajes a América del Sur, lo cual desembocó en la creación con otros administrativistas de América del Sur en la Asociación Iberoamericana de Estudios de Regulación, ASIER, que hoy está presente también en la organización de este congreso. Voy a terminar porque dije que hablaría 10 minutos y llevo ya 11. Gaspar Ariño fue un hombre entre dos mundos. Así he titulado un pequeño obituario que sale en el último anuario de Derecho Administrativo. Un hombre entre dos mundos en verdad. Tomé esta expresión de un ilustrado sueco, Emanuel Swedenborg, que su biografía se titula Un hombre entre dos mundos porque era físico pero también teólogo. Y Gaspar era un hombre entre dos mundos porque era polímata, tenía conocimientos en varias ciencias, en la ciencia política, en el derecho, por supuesto. Pero es un hombre entre dos mundos porque vivió entre el mundo del derecho administrativo clásico, el mejor derecho administrativo que ha tenido España, Eduardo García Enterría lo ha recordado por la profesora Malaret, Villar Parasí y tantos otros insignes administrativistas. Él tenía aquel mundo del derecho administrativo, pero pasó al mundo de la regulación, que se nos presenta hoy como una ciencia social ligada al derecho, por supuesto, pero distinta del derecho. La regulación en la que convergen distintas ciencias, como el derecho, por supuesto, pero también la economía, pero también la ingeniería. Nadie puede ser heterodoxo si no ha sido antes ortodoxo, porque esta es la esencia de las revoluciones científicas, para poder cambiar, salirse de la manada, en un sentido científico, constituido por un paradigma, por una matriz disciplinar, hace falta haber tenido antes en plenitud esa matriz disciplinar. Y esto es, en un sentido kuhniano, lo que hizo Gaspar. Un derecho administrativo tradicional pasó a un nuevo derecho administrativo, el de la regulación, en el cual están implicadas cuestiones de objetivos de política energética, hay cuestiones técnicas, cuestiones económicas, costes marginales, costes medios, todo lo que constituye la regulación. Estas publicaciones en este campo le han hecho brillar entre la comunidad de los administrativistas y desde ahí pudo liderar un proceso de construcción de un nuevo derecho administrativo económico donde la regulación ocupa un lugar preeminente. Esta fotografía que pedí a la profesora Macho Pérez que publicara es la fotografía que me dio una de sus hijas, a quien le dije que iba a tener lugar este acto y le pedí una foto, y es la que me dio. Y quiero terminar precisamente recordando a su familia numerosa con la que estuvo tantos años y a la que dedicó tantos esfuerzos. Muchas gracias. Let me now turn into the pleasure and the joy of introducing yourself and our guest speaker, Professor Leigh Hancher from the Netherlands. Leigh Hancher was born in Scotland. She's a Scottish professor, Scottish person, and studied law in Glasgow and Sheffield in the north of England. After her first law studies, she moved into Florence, to the Florence School of Regulation, the European Institute of Florence. And it's striking that today she is responsible of the legal part of the Florence School of Regulation. So she started there as a PhD student and is now responsible for the legal programs of the Florence School of Regulation. And there, she worked under the guidance of Professor Terz Daintinth. She wrote her PhD about pharmaceutical law, but started with Professor Daintinth a number of publications about energy law. After her PhD, she moved to the Internationaal Instituut voor Energierecht in Leiden in the Netherlands, which was created at the end of the 80s decade of the last century. And there she met those who are today the best representatives of energy law in the academia, like P. Jan Slot, professor in European law, Professor Peter Cameron, director of the Dundee Center, Professor Marta Rochenkamp in Groningen. So that institute, International Institute, was really a place where the new energy law 30 years ago started. Leigh Hancher wrote in 1988, so 25 years now, the first monograph on electricity law. And this is only an example of a countless number of publications in the field on natural gas, market design, competition. She has always been involved in public debate. For example, the single buyer discussion which was proposed by the French government, and in many other issues which were in the public debate in those years. She's particularly expert in state aid law, competition and state aid law. Yesterday she brought as a present for us her last book on the issue, the new state aid law. She has promoted countless research of pupils from the 5 continents. Leigh Hancher is a leader in this field. And she spent as a guest professor times in other universities in the United States of America and Canada, particularly in Calgary, Alberta. She will not be with us tomorrow because she must go back to her work and will be acting in front of the European Court of Justice, because Leigh Hancher, beside his academic work, he's also a renowned lawyer. She worked many years in Allen & Overy of counsel, and now she's working for the other law firms. And she regularly acts as a lawyer in front of the European Court of Justice. Thank you very much, Leigh, for sharing your time with us. We asked her to talk about the new energy law. She was the author of the existing energy law, and she has the keys to understand where energy law is going. So I think there is nobody better than her to talk about this issue. So thank you, and the floor is yours, Leigh.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for an extremely kind introduction. I didn't give you any information, but you seem to have found a lot. And indeed, I have been around for a long time. And so my speech today kind of reflects indeed the new energy law, the issues that we are facing as lawyers, and some of the challenges, I think, of being lawyers in this sector, which is fascinating but troubling given the pace of change we are seeing at the moment. Obviously, you have 2 days ahead of you, very intensive days where you'll be covering a lot of the subjects I'll touch on in depth. So I want to give you maybe just a taste, an overview of where I think we should be maybe worried a little bit about the current way energy law is moving in Europe. So with that, I'll turn to what I'm sure you all know, but just to remember, we've lived through a number of real game changers, and these are game changers for energy and climate law, very important, starting with the launch of the Green Deal, which you might remember was the new incoming president at the time, Ursula von der Leyen, announcing that this was Europe's man on the moon moment, that we were going to transform Europe into the leading continent for climate change and green technology, leading then to the launch of the so-called Fit for 55 package, an enormous package of legislation that was designed then to deliver Europe's climate goals, which have then, of course, been brought into law in the first European climate law in 2021, following which then we had the launch of the so-called decarbonisation package, so modernising the gas sector or the regulation of the gas sector. And everything seemed to be going very well until, of course, COVID hit. And that meant lockdown. And it meant, of course, a great change to the way we all lived and worked, which wasn't too bad for the environment after all. But having just emerged from that, we saw gas prices beginning to surge rather unexpectedly. People got suddenly, they suddenly woke up to something was going on. They found that stocks were low and the price surges were really enormous and very unexpected. This, of course, this concern was trebled, at least, if not more, by the start of the terrible war in February 2022, when Europe's energy supply, of course, of fossil fuels, looked questionable, to say the least. And of course, that problem was confirmed when Russia basically turned off the taps. In the meantime, the direction of policy was changing, and the Commission, at the request of the European Council, launched the so-called REPowerEU policy package and began a series of emergency laws, emergency measures. So it began preparing and adopting these emergency measures. And these are very controversial. I'll come back to that. You'll have a session on REPowerEU, of course, as well. And you'll also have a session on the latest reform, the internal electricity market reform launched in 2023. But for me, a common theme is the emergence of targets and transitions. And the latest game changer is, of course, one that probably no one had anticipated, but which we see now having a really huge impact on energy and climate law, and that is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the US's answer to the Green Deal. But of course, there are many important differences, as I'm sure you all know, and we hear almost daily now as to how easy it is for investors to claim tax credits, and the amount of investment in the US as a result of this IRA is enormous, of course, and attracting not only EU firms to the US, but also attracting a lot of technology development and critical raw materials and many other issues that brings in respect of the resilience of the world's supply of these materials and the processing of these materials. It's not just mining, but also where they're processed is very important. So this act, the IRA, has prompted a big shift. And there's one aspect of it that I'll come back to, which also is much debated at the moment, and that is that the US are boosting the use of hydrogen, but unlike us in Europe, they don't really care whether it's blue or red or pink or yellow hydrogen. In other words, they don't really care whether hydrogen is produced from renewable energy. What they're really focused on is saving greenhouse gas from the production of hydrogen. Now this is then, I think we'll come back to this, but this has meant there's another shift, because we'll see how important competitiveness is now becoming and how that is impacting on the agenda. And the agenda that we have is one based on moving targets. And I think that's, again, important. There are targets everywhere. And if there are no targets, then stakeholders complain because they think it's very important to have targets. And of course, for us lawyers, the first thing we want to know is, well, what's the nature of these targets? Some are binding, some are not. Some are binding only on the EU, and some are not. But very few targets are legally binding at national level. Only two sets of targets are binding at national level. quite different from the first Renewable Energy Directive, where, of course, we had the 20% target at national level, leading to, in this country, of course, to a huge rush to renewables and its subsidization. But what's important is that these targets are not set in stone. They're moving, they're constantly moving. So we saw, for example, the Repower EU package pushing up the European ambition on the RES targets and on energy efficiency targets. But now the Council has downgraded them. Not a lot, but still a few percentages. So again, these targets then are maybe not particularly helpful if they can be so easily changed. Another aspect from a, I think, essentially legal perspective is that the targets are subject to diverse interpretation. So the Climate Act says we should reach net zero by 2050, but what does that concept mean? There are very many ways of calculating net zero. So this is a contested concept. And also, of course, for lawyers, we are interested to know, can we do anything with these targets? Can we enforce them? And if so, how and where? And against whom? Now, especially the climate law target, the 2050 target, we see the rise, of course, of a lot of litigation following the successful Urgenda case, which concerned the Dutch government's failure to deliver the 20% target, in fact. But will we ever see something equivalent at EU level? Now, that's a very open question, and we might have to wait until 2050 to find out the answer. But then we've had not just moving targets, but we have a lot of transitional targets. So we have the 3 emergency regulations that were adopted in the course of 2022 to deal with the immediate impact of the gas crisis, the shortage and the high prices, and of course the impact of the high gas prices on electricity prices. And what do we see there? I think from a legal point of view, and those of you who are administrative lawyers or constitutional lawyers in the tradition of Gaspar, it's important that we actually had very little consultation preceding the adoption of these measures. Of course, the member states were involved at council level, but the European Parliament was not, much to its annoyance. There were no consultations with a wider group of stakeholders, and importantly, there were no impact assessments. And normally, under the EU governance rules, there should be an impact assessment. And under the climate law, there should also be an environmental or climate impact, that the rules do no significant harm. But nothing like this happens. Of course, we have some guidance from the European Court of Justice on how this Article 122 should be applied. We have very old case law dating back from the last major crisis in the oil sector. But the most recent jurisprudence comes from the reliance on Article 122, paragraph 2, to finance the measures adopted in the wake of the financial crisis. And so in the famous case Pringle, the court underlined that these measures had to be temporary and they should only, of course, be proportionate to the emergency that they are dealing with. So the measures, after a bit of debate, are likely now just to expire, with the exception of one, which was the first regulation actually adopted in August 2022, which provides for a system of security of supply alerts across the Union. So if these alerts are triggered, member states are supposed to come together and act in a spirit of solidarity to help each other out by reducing demand in their own countries and being prepared to share with their neighbours. So that is still there because the Commission feels that we are still in what they call a lingering energy crisis. So the risks have not disappeared. It's important to have this emergency legislation to hand. Other parts of these regulations will be absorbed into new legislation. Some of that is pending. For example, the amendments to the electricity regulation that we see in the Commission's proposal to amend the IEM to reform the internal electricity market will include some controls or allow member states to continue price control at the retail level. There will also be other provisions rolled into other pieces of legislation. For example, the third regulation requires fast permitting. I will see that, and that's rolled into the RED 3 or the recast Renewable Directive that should have been adopted by the Council, but has been, of course, postponed. And we also see, and I think this is going to be very interesting, a lot of legal challenges to the security of these energy emergency measures. We have one from Poland challenging the first regulation because it's alleged it interferes with Poland's right to determine its own energy mix, its constitutional right under the treaty. So if Poland's told to reduce demand of gas, they feel that that is problematic. We have a lot of challenges from energy companies, from the big majors, of course, against the third regulation, which introduced windfall taxes. So on the very, very large profits they all managed to make during the crisis. And we have one challenge from a renewable energy producer against the so-called inframarginal levy, which in a way was the same sort of mechanism as a windfall tax, except it was imposed on non-fossil fuel producers who were seen to benefit from the high gas prices that lifted the electricity prices. So this inframarginal rent was meant then to capture those excessive profits. Now, one other moving target is quite an interesting one, because what would happen to everything that we had realized before the energy crisis? And this became a big issue, of course. And the president of the Commission, having sort of always stated that she thought that the single energy market was Europe's greatest achievement, then it seemed in June of last year, some 12 months ago, to change her mind and say, well, actually, that market model is broken and we have to fix it. So people were rather alarmed as to what this was going to mean. ACER was asked to consider change. Consultations were put out. And in March of this year, of course, the Commission launches its reform proposal. Now, there's been a lot of commentary on that, and again, you'll have a session on that. But in brief, the message is, I think, if we look at the proposal, it's don't shoot the messenger. Prices might be high, so electricity prices still set by marginal gas plant will remain high. Of course, as we move to an electricity system where we use far more renewable energy, we still need price signals. And the idea then is, of course, we should retain them. But we need to better manage, especially for consumers, the risks of price volatility that have, of course, frightened many governments in 2022 into giving huge subsidies to retail consumers, as well as commercial consumers and, of course, energy-intensive users. So we've wasted a huge amount of money, or we've at least spent a huge amount of money on these forms of subsidies. For the wholesale markets, the reforms are sort of pushing towards guaranteeing investor certainty, price stability, and what we'll see then, I think, is the introduction, or I should stress, the reintroduction of long-term contracts, so PPAs in the more private contracts then, power purchasing agreements, and contracts for differences, so-called two-way contracts for differences, where we will usually see a public counterparty. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how to design these instruments, and I'm sure that's something you'll also come back to. I hear a lot of discussion about whether or not this has implications for the application of the European state aid rules. Some people think that if you design them correctly, this is not the case. I would disagree with that, especially for CFDs, because you have a public counterparty, and you wouldn't have that if there was a private party willing to take the risk. So you're already in the state aid territory. That doesn't mean they won't be compatible, but it does mean that you're going to have to negotiate that compatibility with the Commission and get a positive clearance. PPAs, of course, also have rather an unfortunate history in Europe as state aids when they were entered into by governments. And although the Commission is pushing PPAs as a private sector solution, what's important is always the small print. They think that member states should guarantee these PPAs, or might have to guarantee these PPAs. And of course, a guarantee that's not provided on market terms, also a state aid. So these are not going to be magic bullets that will lead to easy solutions. And then, of course, not only do we have the reforms to the internal energy market, we're also looking at a lot of other reforms that are aimed at strengthening our strategic energy autonomy, strengthening our access to key raw materials and key technologies to process these raw materials. Again, these were announced by the Commission as a reaction to the IRA. Most of them are still under negotiation, but we do have, for the state aid rules, we do have an amended block exemption regulation, which will make it very much easier, of course, for member states to give aid. And the Commission also very quickly amended its guidance for the crisis and adopted a so-called temporary crisis and transition framework. And part of that framework is meant to offer matching aid, to allow member states to offer matching aid, for example, to companies that might otherwise debunk and emigrate to America. And I would just remark that, again, what we see with the adoption of temporary crisis frameworks and their amendment, we're now on the third amendment to this current temporary crisis framework. The previous one for COVID aid was amended 6 times. These two are not put out to consultation. Normally, the Commission, when it introduces guidelines in the state aid field, also consults quite widely, not just with governments, but with stakeholders. And this is not happening anymore. Now, the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act, they are being adopted under the normal legislative process. They are put out to consultation, and you're already seeing a lot of, especially for the Net Zero Industry Act, a lot of negative commentary, in fact, that it's not enough. But it's just interesting to take a minute, and I'm just conscious of my time. But what's happening is with the adoption of all these emergency measures, those who are in any way close to the Brussels bubble, as it's called, will know that the present Commission is not very open anyway, that all these public lobbying companies are having a lot of trouble, actually, getting into the Commission and doing their usual job. And because the measures are rushed through and because they're restricted to limited consultation, as I've said, there's no impact assessment, you get a lot of contradictions. And you have one Directorate General doing one thing, and you have somebody else doing completely the opposite. Now, maybe that's not so unusual in Europe. There's never been a great deal of consistency, but it's getting worse, and it's problematic. Again, I think from a legal point of view, we should be aware with this new energy law of some of these problems. So the evaluation of the emergency legislation has just been published last week by the Commission, and the Commission observes, and this is taken from that document, that these inframarginal caps, so the caps imposed on the revenue that producers of renewable energy could earn, you might remember it's a cap of 180 euros per megawatt hour. They realized that actually this has been a rather bad thing for these instruments, these PPAs, which they are promoting as being the best way forward to guarantee the targets for the increase in renewable energy that we want to achieve according to Repower Europe. So here we are, that the Commission is saying, well, you know, this has actually been very problematic because they impose this sort of fictitious income on the signatories to PPAs. And ultimately then, they lead to this cap has led to the paradoxical situation whereby the producer may be forced to sell electricity at a loss. Well, that's not what the PPAs were meant to do. And of course, you know, if the Commission is peddling PPAs as being this wonderful way of making sure we get to the renewable targets, then they should be very careful about the measures they adopt. Now, of course, when you read between the lines in this assessment, they're blaming the member states, not their actual, their own communication, and they're saying, well, the member states implemented tougher revenue caps than we thought they would, and so anyway, we think it's a bad measure, so we won't prolong it. But I think it's a very good illustration of not just the harm that can be done, maybe not wittingly, not knowingly, but the lack of consultation, the speed with which these measures have been introduced can lead to paradoxical situations. And that is the history of European energy law, because we're always in transition. When we were in transition from a state sector-dominated electricity and gas sector, particularly electricity, we used PPAs. And then the Commission found out that PPAs actually meant that the market wasn't changing fast enough and attacked them under the state aid rules. So we have several cases, 3 countries where PPAs were actually found to be illegal state aid, and the PPAs had to be abolished. And there's no guarantee that the same will not happen. Again, same with CFDs. CFDs, contracts for differences, are based on a strike price. And if you're looking far into the future and trying to set a strike price, how do you know that that will reflect the market price? And if the state thinks, well, actually, we're paying too much, then there's a very good possibility that it will invoke the state aid rules to try to get out of that contract. That's exactly what happened with PPAs in Hungary, in Poland, currently in Bulgaria. So that state aid rules were used in an opportunistic way for member states to get out of these very instruments that were supposed to promote a transition. So there's a lot of risk that has to be allocated in any transition, and the question will always be, well, who's going to bear the cost? We have more targets coming out of the Net Zero Industry Act. And again, one could ask, well, what do these targets mean? We have different targets for strategic energy technologies, and we have other targets, less ambitious targets for other technologies. And of course, if you followed the discussion here, everybody thinks they have to be in the 40% target range, and especially nuclear, and whether or not existing nuclear should be treated as one of these technologies. So this is really prompted a very intense political discussion. So maybe these targets will also move before the final adoption of this legislation. So targets can set off, even if they're not legally binding, they can have, of course, important implications for whether or not the Commission will approve state aid for the, here, obviously, for the R&D that will be necessary to realize these targets, to bring the research and the technology developed to market. So by getting into the 40% box, into the sort of key box, you're likely to get more funding. So targets can be important. There are also, of course, lots of weighting and targets to try to make sure that we are using EU products. And we have this Article 19, Paragraph 2 in draft form, where member states, when they put out tenders for these key technologies, are supposed to weight the supply of the products in accordance with these rules, so that if they're going to be sourced from Europe, they get a higher rating in the tenders. But it's always a transition, and there's a get-out clause. So if by using this tender procedure, you're going to raise costs for the member state, then you can actually ignore the application. So again, a transition. Hydrogen, I think another example of targets and transition. The decarbonisation package launched back in December 21, it seems almost like an eternity ago. For many people, rather beguilingly, rather strangely, did not define what it meant by renewable hydrogen or low carbon gas, renewable gas, low carbon hydrogen, leading to this big debate, which I already mentioned when we were looking at the IRA, as to whether or not we should be promoting blue hydrogen, which can be, of course, produced from fossil fuel, right through to green. I think yellow there's also a definition of yellow and pink, which I think pink is nuclear. Yellow is, I'm not quite sure exactly anymore what yellow is, but these definitions all float around. But nobody really, my point is nobody really knew or knows which one we're talking about. And this was, of course, a subject of great consternation, because the industry especially argued we need targets, and they wanted binding targets, because that would, of course, commit the member states to actually rolling out hydrogen. And they wanted some clearer definitions of what these concepts of renewable or low carbon hydrogen actually meant. Now, this was a bit of a sad story, because we had a so-called delegated act that was being negotiated, which wasn't going anywhere and which stalled. So the commitment was made in REPAR EU to actually tackle this lack of a definition problem. And again, just to remind you, blue hydrogen will not be a problem under the IRA, but for us in Europe, when we look at the state aid rules, if you want to aid hydrogen production, then if you're producing green hydrogen, as well as hydrogen produced from nuclear electricity, which is a result of French lobbying, is now in there as renewable, then it means that you will get almost a rubber stamp of approval from the Commission for that state aid under the temporary crisis and transition framework guidelines. But if you want to roll out blue hydrogen projects, which of course you still can as a member state, you will have to go before the Commission and argue that they are compatible aid. That will be a case-by-case negotiation. It could be subject to conditions like no carbon lock-in, no stranding of assets. So compared to the US situation, where you can basically just fill in a form and get a tax credit, blue hydrogen projects are certainly not on a level playing field. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not taking a position, but I just want to explain that this type of issue, of course, is now coming up as a matter of competitiveness. If we look at the huge differences in gas prices between the US, the projected prices of hydrogen in the US and in Europe, then these types of definitions and targets are becoming very contentious. What is renewable hydrogen? Well, I think this is also something I'd just like to touch on. is how are we getting to definitions of complex issues, politically sensitive subject matter. And a very good example, of course, we already have in the so-called taxonomy regulation, which is, of course, more directed at private investment, designed to ensure private investment is targeted at non-fossil fuel and sustainable investment. But if you followed that long saga where we had one delegated act where the Commission sort of kicked down the road what to do with gas as a so-called transition fuel and nuclear, it then adopted a second delegated act called the Complementary Delegated Act, where it did classify both nuclear and gas as sustainable. And this has produced now a challenge from a number of NGOs that consider that this classification cannot be justified. So this will be interesting to see whether or not they succeed in their case, which was lodged before the European Court of Justice about 6 months ago. I mean, one of the problems, of course, is that they have to establish standing. But it's a regulation, a secondary act, so they just have to show that they are directly affected and not individually affected. So there might be some margin. But we have the same process going on with the definition of renewable hydrogen. This is then, as I mentioned earlier, the subject of delegated legislation. I think when the Commission published the first version of this delegated act back in late 2021, again, this is not subject to wide consultation. It's not subject to impact assessments, but still, it's attracted a huge amount of controversy, particularly around this concept of additionality. So, to cut a long story short, additionality means that if you're producing hydrogen from renewables, you have to show that you're actually producing more renewable energy, more molecules than you have consumed in renewable electrons. Otherwise, it's a bit of a waste of time to use scarce and valuable renewable electricity to produce less molecules of renewable gas. So the first version of this additionality delegated act led to a huge amount of controversy, and it got more and more complex, and it was eventually withdrawn because it was considered unworkable. A new one was then launched and agreed, and it has to be finally approved. The Parliament asked for an extension, but just as with the Taxonomy Delegated Act, it's pretty certain that this additionality, and there's another one called the methodology, that these will be approved. Is it so complex? Well, many would say actually it's not so complex, but when you look at the rules on additionality, the problem that we have, or many people see with the current version, is it has got a bit simpler, but there's a lot of transition. So if you've already got a PPA, for example, then you will have a transition period, which some people estimate will take you to at least 2035, if not longer. So hidden in these delegated acts are some very complex issues, and I think one of the problems is that these are vital, because if you're renewable, if your energy is dubbed or your hydrogen is renewable, then you are eligible for PPAs, you're eligible, and the preferential treatment that they should get. You're eligible for state subsidies and the preferential treatment that renewable hydrogen subsidies will get. So there's a kind of a chain reaction. So it's very important to get these delegated acts right, but they're kind of not seen as being very political in themselves. That's why they're given to this delegated process. But in fact, many of them are. So summing up, I think I'm at the end. What I've tried to discuss today with new energy law is it's made up of targets, but the targets change. They change constantly, subject to political will. And often these targets also include transitional targets, many of them being derogations from the supposed universal targets that we all want to reach. And as in the delegated act that I just described, they also allow transitions in the very rules. Some of them are temporary, these transitions, but one never knows if the political field is changing, and as we see, we're turning towards a big emphasis on competitiveness. We're seeing both Germany and France backtracking on the adoption of a lot of the Fit for 55, or two at least of the Fit for 55 proposals. So in that kind of political environment, temporary transitions may not prove to be too temporary. There's lack of consultation, I think, has become a bit of a bad habit. The Commission, I think, quite likes not to have to produce extensive documentation for consultation and go through all these options and impact assessments. So if they can avoid it, you'll see more and more that they will. But this leads to not only hasty drafting, but I think very poor design. And we see this, as I tried to illustrate, with the inframarginal levy, which really undermines PPAs. And I think that what we seriously have to consider, and I've written a long article on this, is whether or not we have a crisis of governance. Because, I mean, one of the big questions that we face is whether we really can expect and trust the European institutions, and particularly the Commission, to deliver on the climate acts. Not just ambitions, but actually binding targets. And note, of course, 2022 has been an exceptional year for renewable energy. We've seen more renewable energy come on stream than in any other year, surpassing fossil fuel input. But we've a long way to go. And we really have to, in fact, double the amount of emission reduction that we have achieved so far, but on a yearly basis. So to achieve these ambitions, we are looking at really drastic measures, really drastic change, which means changing the way we use energy and the way, not only the way we use lights and heating, but the way we use energy in the plastic that we remove from our food every day when we eat a sandwich. Every conceivable use of energy will have to be reconsidered. And that is a huge challenge. Is it one that we would trust to the EU institutions to change the way we consume and indeed live? I mean, we don't like it when we're told that maybe our methods of transport have to change drastically, but it could go, of course, much further, and it must if we want to achieve these targets. So this is really a big issue, because I think we will see, because of the renewed focus on competitiveness, I think we'll see that some of these ambitions are going to be thrown into doubt. And we'll see that, I think, quite soon, because in the end of this month, member states have to produce their first drafts of their national energy and climate plans under the governance regulation. The Commission will then start assessing them and give feedback, and then, of course, the revised versions are supposed to be submitted for approval. Now, I think we might see that certain member states will certainly try to dodge their targets and prolong their transitions, and what we will have to wait for with bated breath is whether the Commission will endorse that or not. And I think it might be the latter. So that is my summing up of the new energy law. A lot of work to be done by energy lawyers to keep us all on track. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leigh. You were perfectly on time and in such a interesting and comprehensive and detailed presentation. We are really thankful to the effort and to the lot of information we got about hot issues in current European energy law. We would, of course, be delighted to open a debate, but we are 50 speakers. We have now to start with the second roundtable of this morning, 1 o'clock, so I don't think we are going to bother you with questions. You will be around for a few hours still, and those who want can, of course, address you. And so thank you very much again, and let us start the 1 o'clock panel.